What would you do if your child, a polite, respectful kid with enough money in his pocket, walked into a morning cafe and was refused service just because he didn't look like a customer? Not because he did anything wrong, not because he caused a scene, just because he was a young black boy walking in alone. No one asked his name. No one checked his receipt. No one smiled. Just one suspicious glance and a cold sentence. You should leave. This place isn't for you. But what the barista didn't know was that the boy wasn't alone. And the woman waiting outside, his mother, wasn't someone who would stay silent. It all happened in under 30 minutes. But it was enough to make a system confront itself. Chicago in the early winter morning wasn't loud. It wasn't like the glittering downtown or those lively streets often seen on television. On the south side, everything began in silence. Only the wind howling through windows and the faint hum of the heater groaning like an old familiar sigh. In a worn-out ground-floor apartment tucked beside the street, the dim light of a desk lamp spilled across a frayed old rug. On it sat Jalen Thomas, a 9-year-old boy, cross-legged, focused on the final stitches of a small wallet he had spent weeks sewing. It wasn't the prettiest wallet, the edges weren't even, and the stitches weren't as straight as the ones on TV. But it was Jalen's wallet, made from an old burlap sack from the third-floor landlady's kitchen, offered with a raised brow but kind eyes. The wallet wasn't worth much money, but it held something more valuable: effort, time, and a small but loving purpose. This morning, Jalen woke up earlier than usual, not to study, not because of honking outside, but because yesterday he saw his mother, Dr. Natalie Thomas, come home past 1 a.m., her face gray with exhaustion, her back bent like she was carrying the whole world. She said very little, just greeted him, tousled his hair, and walked straight into the bathroom. Then came the sound of running water, a long sigh, pills falling into a glass. And when she came out, still no complaints. She simply said, "Just 10 minutes of sleep, and I'll be okay." But Jalen knew that wasn't true. He saw the red marks on her wrists, the dark circles under her eyes, the shoulders perpetually tense like drawn bows. And he knew she needed something better than a tired nap. He didn't have much money, but he had an idea. His mom once said, "I wish I could start every morning with a cinnamon cappuccino, like last Christmas." That time, the department head had bought each doctor a cup from Mira and Sons, a fancy coffee shop Jalen only knew from peering through thick glass windows. She drank that cup like she was drinking a different moment, a moment with no ventilators, no patients, no collapsing healthcare system. And Jalen remembered that more clearly than any math lesson in class. So this morning he opened the wallet he made, took out every coin he had saved from shoveling snow for neighbors, babysitting for Miss Ellie downstairs, and sorting old books for his homeroom teacher. He counted carefully: 2 $1 bills, 10 quarters, a few nickels, and one carefully folded wrinkled $5 bill. Just enough to buy one cappuccino from Mira and Sons, or at least he hoped so. He changed clothes, pulled on his old gray hoodie, slipped into the Goodwill shoes his mom bought him, ran his fingers through his hair, and tiptoed out the door. His mother was still asleep, breathing slow but heavy. He shut the door gently and began walking. 6 blocks from home to Mira and Sons was a long way for a 9-year-old, especially in winter, when the wind slapped his face and icy patches shimmered underfoot, waiting to make him slip. But Jalen walked slowly, steadily, not timidly, not eagerly. He was simply doing the right thing. On the way, he saw dogs hurriedly tied to poles, pedestrians rushing with Bluetooth headsets, and a few high schoolers scrambling to catch the bus. No one noticed him, a small black boy, unremarkable, low to the ground. He was used to that. Being unseen was normal in his part of town. But in Uptown, where Mira and Sons was, everything was different. Every shop window was spotless, security guards stood at attention, customers dressed like they'd stepped off magazine covers. Thick glass doors, warm golden light, no rap music or honking cars, only soft jazz, so still you could hear your own footsteps. When Jalen placed his hand on the door handle of Mira and Sons, his heart thumped hard once. He adjusted his collar, gripped the wallet tighter, and pushed the door open. No one turned. No one said hello. But in the air, something shifted, something as thin as thread, but as cold as ice. A white woman behind the counter, hair platinum blonde in a tight bun, red nails arranging cups on a tray, looked up, saw him, then paused. Not long, just a fraction of a second, but enough for her gaze to shift from blank to guarded. Jalen saw it. He had learned to read the air since he was very small. He stepped to the counter and spoke softly. "I'd like to buy a cappuccino, please, with a little cinnamon." The woman didn't smile. She looked at him and asked in a voice not loud, but loud enough for nearby tables to hear, "Where are your parents?" Jalen kept his voice calm. "My mom's asleep. She just got off the night shift." He pulled out his wallet, opened it, and presented the money he'd prepared. "I want to buy it for her." The woman tilted her head. "Who gave you this money?" He blinked, confused. "I saved it myself." She didn't believe him. She looked at the coins as if they were trash. "We don't sell coffee to unaccompanied minors, especially not when the money looks like this." A man in a suit nearby glanced over and shook his head slightly. Two women paused their conversation, but no one spoke up. Jalen began to feel his chest tighten. He lowered the wallet, eyes dropping to his hand, then looked back up, trying to keep his voice steady. "I just want one cup. For my mom." "You should leave," she said, placing her hand on the walkie-talkie under the counter. "You're making other customers uncomfortable. Not everyone wants to be bothered in the morning." "I'm not bothering anyone," Jalen whispered, but the words had no weight in an air thick with prejudice. "Marcus," she spoke into the walkie-talkie, "I need you at the front. We've got a situation. Unaccompanied minor, possibly suspicious." When Jalen heard the word suspicious, his whole body froze. He hadn't stolen anything, hadn't done anything wrong. He had just walked in politely with money, with a reason. But in the eyes of everyone here, none of that seemed to matter, because of who he was, because of how he looked. And then, the door opened again. The door opened again, but not because someone was leaving. A cold gust swept in like a reminder that the world outside was still turning, still breathing, still holding places where fairness could be more than just a dream. But inside Mira and Sons, the air felt frozen. Every movement seemed to lag by a beat, every glance carried a blade. Not sharp enough to draw blood, but just enough to sting the skin. Jalen stood still, not far from the counter, hands still clutching his burlap wallet, fingers digging gently into its edge like they were gripping onto his own pride. He didn't know what to do, didn't know whether he should say something more, or just turn and walk away like he had never existed in this place. But he didn't move. Because walking away now wasn't just about leaving a coffee shop, it was admitting that their stares were right, that he didn't belong here. The room remained bright. Edison bulbs still cast soft golden light on white brick walls, as if nothing had happened. But to Jalen, that light no longer felt warm. It had turned cold, artificial, and fake, like the barista's smile. She no longer bothered to hide her contempt, her eyes sharp like she'd caught a thief mid-scheme. Jalen could see it clearly, even without having learned the rules of eye contact. A 9-year-old might not understand all the laws of this world, but he can sense when he's being judged. And here, inside Mira and Sons, he didn't need anyone to say it aloud to know he had already been accused. To his left, the man in a blue trench coat was staring at his phone, finger gliding across the screen, but his eyes flicked toward Jalen with visible disapproval. Near the window, two white women in yoga wear had stopped chatting. One took a sip of her coffee, eyes fixed on Jalen like she was calculating how much trouble a small black child might cause. The other pursed her lips, pulled out her phone, and angled slightly away. No one said a word. No one intervened. Not a single voice of support. Not a nod, not a wink, not even an encouraging smile. Jalen stood there, his small feet beginning to go numb even though the room was warm. He could feel every stare, every whisper humming beneath the surface like a current. Even the quiet tapping of a keyboard in the corner sounded like thunder to his racing little heart. He turned back to the woman behind the counter. She had removed her hand from the walkie-talkie, arms now folded. "I've called security," she said evenly, like it was something she did 10 times each morning. "You can wait outside if you like, or stand there until you're asked to leave." "I haven't done anything wrong." Jalen tried to keep his voice steady, but every word trembled. Not with fear, with hurt. The kind of hurt that happens when you walk into a place with hope, and what you receive is a stare that denies your very presence, as if you'd violated a sacred rule you never even knew existed. The barista tilted her head, her voice softening in that artificial way. You don't understand. This is a place for special customers. She emphasized special like it was a password meant for someone else. You can go to the corner store. They sell hot chocolate. That's more your type. Jalen didn't reply. He just looked straight into her eyes. He didn't bow his head. He didn't sigh. Even with his heart pounding, he stood tall. His mother once said, "When you feel small, stand up straight, because no one has the right to make you feel smaller than you already are." And Jalen did that, not out of defiance, but out of respect for himself. Every eye in the cafe was on him, like stage lights. But there was no applause, no support, just a silent audience. A young man sitting near the door, probably a college student, furrowed his brow like he was about to say something. But then he looked around, saw no one else was speaking, and returned to his laptop. In Mira and Sons, silence wasn't order. It was consent. It was the sign that everyone either accepted what was happening or, worse, found it normal. Jalen wanted to scream, not for justice, but for truth. That he was just a kid with a burlap wallet he made himself, with $5 earned through honest work, with a single wish, to buy his mother, a woman who had worked through the night in the ER, a cup of cappuccino. Not to show off, not to challenge anyone, but just to make her smile when she woke up. But here, in this place, kindness seemed to have no value unless it came wrapped in an expensive coat or a branded wallet. Footsteps echoed from down the hallway, slow, heavy, deliberate. Someone was coming. Maybe it was security. Maybe it was someone who would put a hand on Jalen's shoulder and ask him to leave. In his mind, he saw his mother, still asleep at home, completely unaware that her son was being treated like a criminal just for walking into the wrong coffee shop. And then he felt angry, not angry at being doubted, angry at being made to feel invisible, as if his very existence was something to be cleaned away, like trash, like noise. But before he could think further, the barista's voice returned, softer now, as if trying to sound sympathetic. You understand, right? This is a limited space. Not everyone fits in. It's not that you're bad, it's just, this place isn't for you. Jalen gripped his wallet tighter. He didn't answer. He didn't know whether he should retreat in silence, like a passing breeze, or stay and prove something. But how could a child prove anything in a room full of people who had already decided not to see him? With each passing second in Mira and Sons, he felt himself shrink, fade, dissolve into the light like he wasn't fully human anymore. And then, a voice broke through the silence. The voice that had just rung out didn't belong to security, nor did it come from anyone intending to help. It was from the barista herself, Catherine Lowell, now stepping out from behind the counter, gripping her walkie-talkie slightly tighter, her gaze no longer hiding its contempt. "Do you even know where you are?" she asked, her tone soft as velvet wrapped around stone, her eyes lowering as if she were looking at a student who had wandered into the principal's office by mistake. Jalen looked at her. He didn't answer. He didn't know what he could say to make that look of disdain disappear. In Catherine's eyes was a mixture of prejudice and power, the kind of power that doesn't come from titles or status, but from the belief that she had the right to reject someone with a single glance. She didn't shout, didn't hurl accusations, didn't use harsh language. But the way she walked forward, small yet deliberate steps, the way she carved each word with precision, built a cold wall between Jalen and the rest of the room. "We've had enough chaos this week already," she continued, stopping just a few feet from him. A kid wandering in alone. No guardian, no reasonable explanation for where the money came from. And now standing here arguing like he has the right to. Her voice wasn't loud, but it rang clear, crafted so everyone in the cafe could hear. A few eyes around the room flicked toward them. No one said anything. The people near the window bowed their heads, pretending to be busy. A middle-aged white man nodded slightly as if agreeing. And Jalen, he still stood there, unmoving, eyes locked on Catherine. But inside, something was beginning to crack. Not fear, but belief. The belief that if he was polite, honest, kind, then people would treat him the same. But apparently not every place ran on the rules of fairness his mother had taught him. Catherine leaned in, her voice lowering. Are you sure this is where you belong? The question wasn't meant to be answered. It was a sentence. No judge, no evidence needed. Just bias. Do you really think a torn wallet and a few crumpled bills are enough to walk into Mir and Sons? She went on, not giving the boy a chance to respond. Our customers expect a certain kind of experience. Quiet, clean, and safe. She stressed the last word like a cold blade drawn across skin. Safe. A word that rang false when used to describe the feelings of the privileged encountering someone like Jalen. Jalen couldn't breathe. Not because anyone touched him, but because the room was squeezing him out through its silence and consensus. He felt himself vanishing, layer by layer, as if his skin, his eyes, his small hands were all fading under the weight of adult stares. He wanted to say, I have money. I have a reason. But that statement had lost value long ago. From the moment he stepped through the door, the moment the wind chime jingled, and Catherine looked up with a gaze that had already rendered judgment. You know, she said, her voice softening again, as if sharing something intimate. There are lots of coffee places on the South Side. Places more suited for you. Places you can go with your friends, bring your burlap wallet, wear your hoodie and not make anyone feel uncomfortable. She smiled, a thin, hollow smile like a window with no posters. That's not a bad thing. It's just the truth. Just like there are places for grown-ups and places for kids. You understand, right? Jalen didn't answer. He just looked straight into her eyes, didn't look down, didn't step back. He had nothing left to say. Not because he was wrong, but because every word had already been twisted and emptied. In this place, his presence was something that couldn't be redeemed with words. A soft beep came from the electronic door. Someone had just entered, but no one turned. Catherine didn't turn either. She kept staring at Jalen like she was studying a stain on her shirt, deciding whether to scrub it out or toss the whole thing. You should go, she whispered as if offering one final grace, before this becomes unpleasant. She had barely finished her sentence when Jalen heard footsteps behind him, growing louder, heavier, carrying the weight of intervention. Maybe it was security. Maybe it was someone who had finally realized this was wrong. But Jalen didn't dare turn around. He was afraid of seeing another face with the same look in their eyes. And then, among all the stares circling him, the cold rising from the tile floor, the thudding heartbeat of a boy who just wanted to do something good, he heard the first voice that carried neither threat nor pity. Step away from my son. The air inside the cafe froze at that exact moment. Every movement stopped. Every gaze turned in one direction. Not toward Jalen, the small boy with oversized shoes and a burlap wallet, but toward the woman who had just stepped through the door. She wasn't loud. She wasn't hurried. But each step she took seemed to ring louder than the background music, louder than all the condescension Catherine had just uttered. She wore no uniform, no name tag, just a sleek black coat, her hair tied up, eyes deep, and her voice, the voice that had just cut through the atmosphere like a sharp blade through silk. Step away from my son. Catherine Lowell spun around. In that instant, on a face trained to maintain professional composure, there was a flicker of alarm, as if she had just realized she had insulted the wrong person, but instinct held her ground. I'm sorry, she said, no longer mocking but still trying to maintain a bare minimum of politeness. The woman didn't respond immediately. She walked forward, not rushed, but with a stride no one dared block, and stopped beside Jalen. One hand she placed on her son's shoulder. The other reached toward the wallet still clenched in Jalen's grip, but she didn't take it. She simply touched his hand, her way of saying, I'm here now. Then she turned to Catherine. Let me ask again. Who gave you the right to accuse a child without evidence, without cause, and without my permission? Catherine stepped half a foot back. Ma'am, the boy came in alone. He didn't have a guardian, and his money looked suspicious. Suspicious? The woman repeated the word as if evaluating it from an official report. Do you have any proof that my son stole something? Did you witness any behavior indicating he threatened customers, damaged property, or disrupted business operations? No, but you called security. The woman's tone remained unchanged, calm even, but something in the way she clipped each word shut Catherine's mouth. And you did that based on what? The torn wallet? Or was it the color of his skin? Catherine opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Not because she didn't have words, but because no words could hide the truth. In those few seconds of silence, Jalen stood still. He said nothing, didn't lift his head, but his whole body, now sheltered by his mother, stopped trembling. Not because everything was fine, but because he wasn't alone anymore. The woman inhaled deeply, and for the first time that morning, she raised her voice enough for the entire cafe to hear. Not loud, but resonant. My name is Natalie Thomas. I am the Director of Investigations at the Federal Security Agency. And the child you dismissed, the child you watched being humiliated without a word, is my son. A quiet but powerful wave rippled across the room. A man dropped his spoon. An elderly woman lowered her head. A young girl at her laptop stopped typing mid-keystroke, but no one spoke. Natalie didn't wait for a reaction. She turned to Catherine and began to speak slowly, like reading from a legal document. You called security without just cause, denied service to a customer based on appearance and age, and made unfounded assumptions of criminal behavior. I believe this violates Section 201, Clause 2 of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Catherine froze. I didn't mean, Natalie interrupted. You did mean to, and I will make sure it's documented. The entire surveillance footage from this morning will be collected. I will file an official complaint. But before we get to legal matters, I want you to look at this child and answer honestly. If my son were a white boy, wearing a J. Crew sweater and carrying a crocodile leather wallet, would you have called security? Catherine didn't respond. Natalie didn't wait. The answer is no. So today you didn't just insult my son. You insulted the dignity of everyone who believes that a child, regardless of background or skin color, deserves to be treated with basic human respect. She bent down, looked her son in the eye. Did you do anything wrong? Jalen shook his head gently. I just wanted to buy you a coffee. And you did the right thing. The only thing wrong here is how they saw you. Natalie stood back up. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't demand an apology. But her presence had shifted the entire atmosphere. Catherine was no longer in control, no longer in power. She was just someone who had been stripped bare of a truth she had denied her whole life. That behind her polished professionalism lived a prejudice. And that prejudice had turned a child trying to do something kind into a threat to be expelled from a space that should have welcomed him. Natalie didn't leave. She didn't hurry her son away as if to avoid trouble. She stood there holding Jalen's hand, looked Catherine square in the eyes and said her final line. I'm not going anywhere. I'm waiting for the manager. Then she turned to her son, calm but firm. You did nothing wrong, and we don't leave a place just because they say we're not welcome. Jalen looked up. For the first time since he had entered the cafe, his eyes were no longer afraid. He didn't say anything, but his hand tightened around his mother's, as if now he was finally standing tall. The atmosphere inside Mira & Sons had shifted, but not in a comforting way. The subtle chill of polite indifference was gone, as was the awkward panic of people caught doing wrong. What replaced it was a new kind of silence, tight as a violin string, lingering, saturated with shame, justification, and fear. The customers seated around the cafe, the ones who didn't turn their heads when Jalen walked in, who said nothing when he was insulted, who didn't move when Catherine called security, now found themselves awkwardly grappling with their own silence. A man wearing headphones took them off, then put them back on. An older woman stared down into her teacup, stirring it continuously, though it had long gone cold. A young student glanced at Jalen, then quickly turned back to his screen, as if the whole thing were a video not meant to be watched for too long. No one said a word. No one apologized. No one did anything. Natalie stood in the center of it all, calm, not angry, not rushed. Her hand still held her son's, his small fingers now steadier than before, though not yet strong. Jalen looked up, scanning the room, but instead of sympathy or solidarity, all he received were quick glances, busy faces, and subtle avoidance. No one had stood up for him, Not earlier and not now, even after the truth had been laid bare. He didn't know what hurt more, the direct insult from one person or the complicit silence of an entire room. Catherine remained behind the counter, her expression wavering between confusion and defensiveness. Her mind was probably racing through dozens of scenarios, excuses, denials, explanations. But none of them were strong enough to override the reality that the woman standing before her, the mother of the boy she had humiliated, was none other than a federal investigations director. And she had called security on that woman's son. Natalie no longer looked at Catherine. She turned instead to the other staff member behind the counter, a young man pretending to polish cups. "Where's your manager?" Natalie asked. He blinked, his hands freezing mid-motion. I think he's upstairs. I'll call him." Natalie didn't wait for confirmation. "Call him now, because we're not going anywhere." And then, something no one expected happened. Natalie pulled out a chair at the nearest table, the same table where, minutes earlier, two women in yoga gear had been whispering. She sat down. Jalen remained standing. Natalie looked up at her son and asked gently, "Do you want to leave?" He shook his head. "I didn't do anything wrong." "Then we'll wait," Natalie said, as if they were simply waiting for brunch on a lazy Sunday morning. She sat upright, hands resting on the table, eyes steady. Jalen pulled out a chair, sat beside her, and looked around again. The room was still silent, still pretending he wasn't there. But something had shifted. Behind every glance, every fidget, every evasive gesture, there was now an unease that no one dared to name. A man near the door stood up, not to leave necessarily, but perhaps because he couldn't bear it anymore. He abandoned his latte and made his way quickly to the exit. As he passed Jalen's table, he looked at him, just for a second, then immediately turned away. No words, no nod, just eyes filled with panic, as if he were running from his own conscience. Another customer, a white middle-aged woman, quietly closed her laptop, stood up, then changed her mind. She sat down again but didn't reopen the computer. She stared out the window, eyes blank. It was the quietest sentence Jalen had ever walked through. No insults, no shouting, no one dragging him out. Just a room full of adults who all knew he had been wronged, and all chose to do nothing. A sentence with no paper, no judge, but enforced through every glance, every beat of the heart. And Jalen, the boy with the burlap wallet and a kind intention, had to walk through it all just to learn a truth. Kindness in this place wasn't enough. A while later, the manager appeared, hair unkempt, shirt not fully buttoned, eyes weary. He froze when he saw Natalie and Jalen, then glanced toward Catherine. For a moment, Jalen saw confusion in his face, but not because he didn't understand what had happened. It was because he understood it far too well. Natalie didn't wait for him to speak. She stood up quietly but firmly and said, "I'm Natalie Thomas. I request that the full security footage from this morning be preserved. I will be submitting a legal request for retrieval and storage. This matter will not be forgotten, not just because this is my son, but because today a child walked into a public place carrying money he earned on his own and was labeled a threat simply because he didn't look like your usual customer, and no one did anything." The manager had no response. Catherine lowered her head. The other employees stood frozen, but Natalie wasn't looking for shame. She was looking for justice, and she had only just begun. In a room full of people yet silent as stone, sometimes it takes only one sentence, spoken at the right time, for the entire atmosphere to flip like an old rug. Natalie Thomas, standing at the center of Mira & Sons, the very place that had treated her young son like a system malfunction, did not raise her voice, did not pound a table, and did not invoke her title or authority. She simply spoke 5 words, in a low tone sharper than any accusation. "This is my son." She didn't say it like someone demanding justice for herself. She said it like a mother, and like a senior officer who had seen enough forms of injustice to refuse tolerating even one more, especially when it targeted the child she loved most. Every gaze turned toward her, including those that had tried to avoid looking just moments before. A woman of calm appearance, not angry, not blaming, but her eyes seemed to pierce through the thick glass of fake civility that coated this room. Natalie looked straight at the manager, the young man frozen between two worlds. On one side, the comfort of wealthy clientele. On the other, the undeniable truth that his establishment had just subjected a 9-year-old black boy to unnecessary humiliation. I don't need you to say things like, "We're sorry," or "We'll review our procedures," Natalie said clearly, each word hammering into the floor like a nail. I need to know, who here decided that a child walking into your store with a wallet and money he earned should be treated as a threat? Who taught your staff that skin color and age are acceptable metrics for assessing risk? And who here will be brave enough to say it out loud instead of silently going along with it? Catherine, the barista who had started it all, remained behind the counter, saying nothing. The arrogance had drained from her eyes. There were no more carefully polished sentences laced with false courtesy. Only silence remained, the kind familiar to those who have long held privilege, when they are first dragged into the light, not by media, not by a public protest, but by the undeniable presence of truth. Jalen sat next to his mother, unmoving. He didn't need to stand, didn't need to speak. The fact that he was still there, after everything, was itself a declaration. He hadn't left. He hadn't backed down. He hadn't allowed anyone to push him out of a place he had every right to enter, like anyone else. Natalie placed a hand on her son's shoulder, her voice shifting for the first time from cold to warm. Not for the room, but for Jalen himself. "You were not wrong to believe in kindness," she said, "and I want you to remember this. Kindness is not defined by where you're standing, but by what you do while you're there." She turned back to the cafe's customers, those still silent, still voiceless, though their eyes were now wavering. The contempt was gone, but remorse hadn't quite taken its place. Their faces floated somewhere in between, half wanting to disappear, half waiting to see what would happen next. Natalie didn't let them off easily. Kindness is not staying silent when someone is being insulted right in front of you. It is not nodding and then looking down. It is not sipping your latte while a child is called a threat just because he doesn't dress like you, doesn't carry the same last name as you, doesn't look like you. She didn't shout, but every word struck against the invisible wall that everyone knew existed here. The wall built from biases so subtle, even the people who built it believed they were just preserving the space. The manager finally spoke. His voice trembled, trying to sound professional. "We're sorry. This doesn't reflect the core values of Mira and Sons. We'll be taking internal action." Natalie didn't nod, didn't accept. She simply asked, "What core values? The ones that allow you to call security on a child before even asking his name?" He fumbled. I wasn't here when it happened. But you're the manager, so I want to know, starting tomorrow, what will Mira and Sons teach its employees? That every black child is a potential suspect? That a burlap wallet signals fraud? Or that silence is a defensive strategy when prejudice is exposed? No one answered. No one stood. But the silence was different now. It no longer held its shape. It had begun to crack. A young woman sitting near the window slowly took out her phone, not to scroll, but to record, not to judge, but perhaps, for the first time, to capture something that actually mattered. Natalie didn't care who was filming. She stood there with her son, as if the world owed this child something no one had had the courage to say out loud. She didn't need applause. She didn't need approval. She just needed her son to know that in this room, among all the eyes that once dismissed him, there was one person who would never be silent, and that person was his mother. Natalie stood tall, eyes fixed on the manager, but this time her voice wasn't directed at any one person. It was meant for the entire room, for every pair of eyes avoiding the direct gaze of truth. "I don't care who you are, what industry you work in, how much you earn, or how many times a week you buy coffee," she said, every word as distinct as a heartbeat. "But I want all of you to look at my son, Jalen, and be honest with yourselves. If this morning my son had walked in wearing a clean school uniform, carrying a leather wallet with an Ivy League haircut, would anyone have called security?" She didn't wait for a reply. The answer is no, and we all know it. The manager clenched his hands in front of him, as if trying to contain his discomfort. But Natalie wasn't here to protect his comfort. She turned to Catherine. You were the first person to see my son this morning. You didn't smile. You didn't ask what he needed. You asked, where are your parents? You looked at his burlap wallet and assumed it was stolen. You saw a few wrinkled bills and concluded they were suspicious. You didn't see a child. You saw a risk. Catherine opened her mouth, but Natalie raised her hand. Don't tell me you didn't think that. You already acted. I don't need a psychological breakdown. I need the truth. Inside Mira and Sons, no one moved. No keyboards clicked. No one sipped coffee. The room was being forced to witness itself. Natalie didn't speak loudly, but her words stripped away the glossy civility, wrapping this place like frosting on a moldy cake. The problem here isn't about polite tone or professional communication, she said. The problem is the core itself. You're sugar-coating prejudice, dressing up bias with sweetness. You call it store policy. You call it risk management. You call it customer standards. But the essence hasn't changed. You saw a black child alone, with no adult present, and you thought, danger. Jalen looked at his mother, not with his chin raised in pride, but because now he felt safe. He felt seen. He felt like someone was naming aloud the very thing he didn't know how to describe. He had once thought he wasn't good enough, didn't belong, but his mother hadn't just proven that he did belong here. She had proven that this space was the one in need of repair. Is there anyone here? Natalie asked, sweeping her gaze across the room. Any single person willing to stand and say that calling security on a child with a burlap wallet was the right thing to do? Not a hand rose. I don't need you to be heroes. I just need you to be honest. The truth is, you all saw what happened, and you stayed silent. That's not neutrality. That's choosing a side. And the side you chose was silently backing prejudice. An elderly woman nearby shrank back, placing her hands on her lap, eyes downcast. The young woman recording still didn't speak, but the camera stayed on. Natalie continued, her tone steady and emotionless, but now heavy with responsibility. I've worked crime scenes, hunted murderers, handled national security crises, but no place has chilled me the way this room has. A place full of educated, accomplished adults who saw a child being dehumanized and chose to sit still. The manager took a deep breath, as if trying to regain control, but Natalie cut him off before he could try. If you think a free voucher or a templated apology will fix this, then you've underestimated my son, and you've underestimated yourself. She turned to Jalen. Do you want to leave? He shook his head. Then we stay. Natalie sat back at the table, her gaze calm. We do not walk away from a space where you have a right to be, just because others aren't used to seeing you there. That was when Catherine finally spoke, her voice small but audible. I was just following policy. Natalie didn't smile, didn't scold. She looked directly at her. Policy never required you to strip someone of their dignity. Policy didn't force you to look at a child and assume he was a liar. Policy didn't forbid you from smiling or asking a simple question. What do you need, sweetheart? What made you do this wasn't policy. It was a belief deeply rooted in you, that people who don't look like your ideal customer don't deserve to be welcomed. Catherine lowered her head, for the first time since it all began, without anything left to say. Natalie wasn't waiting for an apology. She wasn't waiting for remorse. She just needed the silence to reflect what it truly was. Unavoidable confrontation. She added, not for Catherine, but for Jalen, and for every child who had ever been taught to quietly endure injustice. We shouldn't be teaching our children how to fit into a world that doesn't welcome them. We should be teaching the world how to welcome children like mine. Then she looked across the cafe, gaze firm, not confrontational, but unflinching. This is my son. This is Jalen Thomas, a 9-year-old child, not a threat, not something to fear, just a boy who wanted to bring his mother a cinnamon cappuccino after a night shift. She placed her hand gently on his shoulder, her voice softening, but never losing strength. And if a place like this isn't kind enough to understand that, then it's this place that needs to change, not my son. The room had heard everything, not in the way someone listens to a morning news segment or a podcast through Bluetooth earbuds, but in the way that makes your body stop cold, makes your heartbeat drop a pace, makes your spine straighten and your eyes lift from the screen. A kind of listening that doesn't come with permission, but is forced upon you by the sheer weight of truth. Because of the mother standing in the middle of the cafe, because of the boy clutching his handmade wallet, because every word spoken had driven stakes into the air, stakes that could not be pulled back. No one inside Mira and Sons that morning could now claim they didn't know. No one could say, maybe it wasn't that serious. No one could say, that's someone else's problem. Because from the moment Natalie Thomas spoke, not by shouting, not by preaching, but by naming exactly what had taken place, the entire room became witnesses, not to an incident, but to something larger. The truth that prejudice doesn't always come dressed in something ugly. It often arrives in a pressed suit, behind a polite smile, with the phrase, "It's our store policy." It doesn't scream. It strangles with procedure. And this morning it had been unmasked, right in the place it thought was safest, a high-end coffee shop. The manager said nothing. The young man behind the counter had stopped wiping glasses, frozen like a paused frame from a film. Catherine Lowell, the barista from this morning, still hadn't lifted her head. Her long silence no longer resembled confidence. Now it was a kind of helpless confusion. No one came to rescue her. No one spoke on her behalf. And Natalie didn't need to do anything more. The room was now doing the rest. A faint cough sounded from the far corner. An older man adjusted his scarf. A young woman pulled up her sleeve, then let it fall. Someone opened their phone's camera app but didn't raise it. Every small action now carried meaning. Every sideways glance was an unspoken confession. Jalen didn't look at any of them. He just looked down at the table. But it wasn't shame. It was a deep, settled fatigue. He didn't cry. He didn't pull his hand from his mother's. But he had seen it all, heard every word, and understood that some kinds of exhaustion don't come from being pushed out, but from being forced to prove you have the right to stay. Natalie said nothing more. She had said enough, enough to be heard, enough that no one could forget. She took out her phone, opened her recorder, but she didn't start a new recording. She played a file already labeled, Mira and Sons, 7:38 a.m. Catherine's voice filled the air, clear, raw, and unedited. We don't sell to children, especially not when the money looks questionable. Then the sound of the walkie-talkie. I've got a situation at the front. Minor, unaccompanied, might be loitering, possibly handling questionable cash. The sound rang out through the cafe, which had been too quiet for too long. No one protested. No one said it was taken out of context, because there was no context that justified calling a child a situation. When the recording ended, Natalie tucked the phone back into her bag and turned to the manager. I will be submitting this recording along with a formal complaint to the city's Civilian Oversight Office, the mayor's office, and independent corporate bias watchdogs. I'm not doing this because I'm angry. I'm doing it because if I don't, then tomorrow another child will walk in here and be treated the exact same way. It might be my son. It might be someone else's. The manager nodded slowly, not in agreement, in surrender. He understood. Everyone in the room understood. Natalie continued, quieter now, but every bit as clear. This cafe used to be a symbol of refinement, of upscale service. But today it's just evidence of one simple fact. Not every fancy space knows what respect means. Then she turned to her son. Jalen, you can choose to leave now, or stay. Have your coffee. Like a real customer. It's your decision. Jalen looked up. For the first time since he'd walked in, he actively scanned the room, looking at each person, not to seek approval, but to let them see that he had seen everything. Then he spoke, his voice still soft but steady. I want to stay. Natalie nodded. Good. The air was no longer suffocating, but it wasn't light either. The heaviness remained, slow burning, but now there were fractures in it. Someone had dared to name the truth. Someone had dared to stay, not to provoke, but to refuse surrender. And now the silence wasn't complicity. It was reckoning. The scent of coffee in the cafe no longer smelled like it did on a normal morning. It no longer signaled alertness, lifestyle, or morning meetings with a latte in hand. It had become a background smell, clinging to the walls that were now witnessing something Mira and Sons had never been prepared to face, a customer who refused to leave. Not out of protest, but simply because there was no reason to. No crime, no incident, no fault, nothing but an unmade cappuccino and a truth that was now impossible to ignore. This cafe had not welcomed that boy, and now that boy had decided to stay, like any other customer. Jalen didn't bang the table, didn't demand to be served. He simply sat there next to his mother, as if continuing to exist was already the bravest act he could perform. Natalie looked at her son and saw that his posture had changed. He was no longer curled around the wallet in his hand. He had released it, not because he wasn't tense, but because he had passed through the cold of rejection. And now he was warming himself through his own choice, to stay. The manager hadn't said another word. He didn't know what to do with the situation. He couldn't ask the customer to leave. He couldn't call security. He couldn't invoke a standard protocol anymore. Because for the first time, every protocol had been rendered meaningless in the presence of a child who was quietly proving his right to exist. Catherine Lowell still stood behind the counter. Her hand touched the espresso machine, but she hadn't moved. Natalie turned toward her, not harsh, not hostile, but with a gaze that made Catherine step half a pace back. "You asked my son this morning, are you sure this is a place for you? Now it's my turn to ask you, are you sure this is still a place worthy of serving someone like my son?" Catherine didn't respond, not because she wasn't allowed to, but because there was nothing left to say that could undo what had been done. Natalie didn't wait for a reply. She continued, her voice steady like reciting a pledge. "I don't need you to feel regret. I need you to understand. Some mistakes aren't repaired by apologies. They're repaired by lasting change. And sometimes that change begins with serving a single cup of coffee the right way to someone you once refused." No one clapped. No one gasped. But the room had changed. No longer avoidance. Now, anticipation. A young staff member behind the counter stepped forward, glanced at Catherine, then turned to Natalie. "What would you like to order, ma'am?" Natalie didn't answer. Jalen turned to his mother. Natalie looked at him. "Your choice." The boy nodded, turned to the staff, and said softly but clearly, "One cappuccino, extra cinnamon. For my mom, that was all. But it was a statement louder than any slogan." The employee took the order. No one objected. No one interrupted. Catherine stepped back and let someone else take over. The machine hissed gently, a familiar sound in any cafe, but today it rang like a new rhythm in the air. When the cappuccino was placed on the counter, no one had to say a word. Natalie and Jalen stood together. The boy stepped forward, slowly, without bowing his head, without shaking. He picked up the cup, turned the lid slightly, the way his mother always did in the mornings. No one said thank you, no one said sorry, but the glance from the barista, brief, sincere, said what needed saying. Jalen returned to the table. He placed the cup in front of his mother. Natalie looked at her son, then reached for the cup. A simple gesture, but for her and for everyone watching, it was a restoration. Not validation from the cafe, but a reclaiming of their own truth, that the boy had never been wrong. And if anything needed restoring that morning, it was the simple right to be treated with kindness, without having to fit into a costume made of stereotypes. After a few quiet minutes, Natalie stood. Jalen stood too, but they didn't leave right away. Natalie turned and looked around the cafe, like someone gently closing the final page of a chapter she had written, not in fury, but in quiet, unyielding clarity. "We stayed today, not to disrupt, but to remind everyone that some things need to be rebuilt from the beginning, from how we look, how we think, to how we serve." She didn't raise her voice, but each word left its imprint on the brick, on the glass, in the air, and in the memory of those who had stayed silent this morning. "I'm not leaving," Jalen had once told his mother, and he kept his word, not through protest, but by sitting down, placing a coffee cup on the table, and making sure no one could forget that he had been there. No one at Mira and Sons that morning recorded the moment the cappuccino was placed on the table. No one raised their phone to capture the image of a mother taking a coffee from her son's hands. There were no comments, no gasps, no hashtags launched on social media in that instant. And maybe that was for the best. Because if anything deserves to be preserved in complete stillness, it's the moment of restoration. The small cappuccino, with its white lid, steam gently rising, the scent of cinnamon softly curling through the air. It wasn't the smell of a brand. It was the smell of memory. Natalie received the cup as if receiving something old and precious, not because of how much it cost or what machine brewed it, but because the person placing it in front of her was her son, the child who, earlier that morning, had been deemed unfit, stopped, judged, and who had overcome it all simply by staying. No argument, no spectacle, just a quiet resolve that could not be pushed aside. Jalen didn't say a word as he handed her the coffee. He didn't wait for her to say anything either. He simply sat back down, placed his hands on his knees, eyes resting on the cup as if it were both a reward and a declaration, a sign that he had not backed down. Natalie lifted the cup to her lips, took a small sip. The taste was both unfamiliar and deeply familiar. The bitterness of strong coffee, the smoothness of milk, the thick foam, and a dusting of cinnamon, just as she remembered. But today, the flavor wasn't just a drink. It was the product of a child who had walked 6 blocks in the cold to bring it to her. It was a thank you that didn't need to be spoken. It was love, poured out coin by coin into a burlap wallet. No one disturbed that moment. Customers in the cafe slowly began to rise. A few left quietly. Others remained, eyes turned outward as if replaying in their minds everything that had just unfolded. Catherine had withdrawn behind the counter, silent. The manager, perhaps realizing that no procedural fix could restore what had broken, stood frozen near the door, afraid that even a single movement might shatter everything further. No one came to serve anything else. No one cleared the table. But Natalie didn't ask for that. She simply sat with her son, sipped her coffee, and waited. Waited for the tension in his small shoulders to release. Waited to see him finally begin to relax. Waited for the space to shift, not from a place of harm, but into the possibility of a new beginning, even if only for this one cold winter morning. A young woman approached the table. She held a napkin, her eyes hesitant. Natalie looked at her, neither nodding nor smiling, just waiting. The woman bowed her head slightly, placed the napkin on the table, and turned away. Natalie glanced down. Just a few words, handwritten. I was here this morning. I did nothing. And I'm sorry. I won't let it happen again. Natalie said nothing. She folded the note and placed it in her wallet, not to keep, but to remember. She looked at Jalen. How do you feel? The boy answered slowly, eyes still on his hands. I don't know. That's okay, Natalie said. We don't always have to know. What matters is, we didn't walk away. Jalen looked up. I didn't want to leave like I did something wrong. Natalie nodded. And you didn't leave. You stayed. That's what people will remember. Not because of me, not because of my title, but because you made that decision for yourself. Jalen didn't smile, but something in his eyes softened, as if that cappuccino, and everything it had taken to earn it, had soothed the cold that hadn't come from weather, but from the gaze of adults. 15 minutes later, Natalie and Jalen stood. They didn't say goodbye. They didn't need anyone to see them off. But as they passed the counter, the young barista who had taken Jalen's order said quietly, You were really brave. Jalen turned, didn't speak, but nodded. His oversized shoes still made soft sounds across the wooden floor. The burlap wallet in his pocket still pressed gently against his side. The door opened. Cold wind swept in. But this time Jalen didn't walk out like a child who had been hurt. He walked out like someone who had stepped through the shadow of judgment, with his head held high and his dignity intact. 3 days after that morning, the wind in Chicago hadn't softened. But inside the small ground floor apartment in Southside, the kitchen was warmer than usual. Early sunlight filtered through the mesh curtain, casting a glow on the table where 2 cereal bowls sat, a glass of milk, and a white envelope resting quietly. The envelope didn't list a sender on the front, only the embossed logo of Mira and Sons and a small printed line beneath. To Ms. Natalie Thomas and Jalen Thomas. Jalen had been eyeing it since he entered the kitchen. He recognized the logo, recognized the font, recognized the effort to package respect in clean, symmetrical black ink. He hadn't touched it. His mother had placed it there the night before, after receiving it from the mail carrier, and had yet to open it. He hadn't asked. Natalie had only said simply, "We'll read it when you're ready." And this morning, when she walked into the kitchen and found Jalen still staring at the envelope, as if weighing whether to open a door back into memory, she said, "Today's okay." Natalie opened the envelope with her bare hands. No letter opener, no tearing. She pulled out a thick sheet of paper, high quality, printed in a clean serif font. Reading slowly, she skipped nothing. To the Thomas family, on behalf of the Mira and Sons team, we extend our deepest regrets regarding the experience you had at our Uptown location this past Tuesday morning. We acknowledge that the situation was not handled in alignment with the values of service Mira and Sons strives to uphold. We are initiating internal reforms, including retraining staff on cultural sensitivity, anti-discrimination, and best practices for engaging with underage customers. Additionally, the staff involved have been reassigned and will not return to front-facing roles until they complete a special restorative training program. We sincerely apologize to Jalen for feeling unwelcome in a space that should have been friendly to all. We hope this apology will be received as a gesture of good faith. Sincerely, Mira and Sons Corporate Office. When Natalie finished reading, she placed the letter on the table. She didn't fold it, didn't tuck it away. She didn't look at Jalen right away. She simply rested her hand on the table's edge, eyes drifting toward the wall where a photo of the two of them hung, taken at the spring science fair last year. Jalen, in a white button-up, stood in front of a trifold board labeled "How Coffee Beans Grow," flashing a toothless, proud smile. Jalen finally spoke. "Do you think they really mean it?" The question wasn't bitter. It wasn't sarcastic. It was the honest skepticism of a child who had walked through hurt. Natalie turned to him. "They did apologize. Whether they understand what really happened, that's something only time can answer." She picked up the letter and walked over to the refrigerator. She didn't file it away, didn't place it in a drawer. Instead, she used a small magnet, the heart-shaped one Jalen had sculpted in art class, to pin it to the door, right next to the science fair photo. "I thought you'd put it away," Jalen said. Natalie shook her head. Some things shouldn't be hidden, not because they're good, but because they're true." Jalen stepped closer, looking at the letter pinned beside snapshots of happier memories, photos of him learning to swim, getting a haircut, hugging the neighbor's cat. The white letter stood out, but didn't feel out of place. It felt like a reminder that even the safest spaces can make a child feel like they don't belong if the grown-ups inside don't have the courage to confront their own bias. "Are you going to write back?" Jalen asked. Natalie shook her head. "Their letter doesn't need a reply. Our job is to live on, to live in a way they can't forget us." She bent down and rested a hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing, and you don't need a letter to prove that." Jalen looked at the letter once more, then nodded. "Then I'll leave it there." And from his backpack, he pulled out a sheet of drawing paper, simple, colored in pencil, not yet fully shaded. On it was a sketch of a coffee shop with large glass windows and two figures, an adult and a boy, walking through the door. Above it, Jalen had written, "Everyone deserves to belong." He took another magnet and pinned it beside the letter. Natalie stood still. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. But inside her was a quiet pride, one that didn't need to be said out loud. No one expected Jalen Thomas to choose belonging as the topic for his final presentation in 8th grade sociology. He had always been the type of student who sat in the middle rows, rarely spoke up, chose his words carefully, and avoided subjects that might place him at the center of attention. But on Thursday afternoon, in a classroom lit like a quiet auditorium awaiting the rise of the curtain, Jalen stepped up to the front, holding a folded sheet of paper, eyes steady on the 28 students and Ms. Davis, all waiting. "Hi, everyone," he began. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. "Last week, something happened. Some of you might have heard about it already." A pause. "I wasn't going to talk about it because it felt too personal. But then I thought, if I don't say it, who will?" Ms. Davis gave a small nod, as if silently passing him a thread of confidence. Jalen continued, "My mom and I went to a coffee shop, just a regular place it seemed, but I was denied service just because I'm a black kid, alone, and no one believed I could afford a cappuccino." A few students glanced at each other, surprised. Some leaned in slightly, not because the incident was unbelievable, but because the one telling it was Jalen, the quiet kid they never thought would speak out. Jalen didn't dramatize it. He didn't choke up. He didn't use big theatrical words. It was a quiet retelling with logical flow, real experience, measured emotion, and most importantly, a conclusion that cut like a silent blade. "After that day," Jalen said, "I didn't think I was going to change the world, but I knew one thing. I can't let anyone else decide where I belong." He paused, then lifted his head. "Because the feeling of belonging doesn't come from permission slips, membership cards, money, or skin color. It comes from how we choose to stay, even when others want to push us out." Ms. Davis placed a hand over her heart. Some classmates nodded. Others looked down, not in shame, but in thought. Jalen closed his presentation with a line that left the whole room in a kind of pause, as if time itself had held its breath. "I don't need anyone to open the door for me. I just need enough courage to knock and stand there long enough for them to see me." That evening, in the same kitchen where the apology letter still hung on the fridge, Natalie took out her phone and opened a message thread. She didn't usually send photos of Jalen to many people, but this time she sent one. Him standing at the front of the class, holding his paper, eyes bright, legs slightly trembling, just like any 13-year-old who had just stepped through his own fear. She added a caption, "He belongs." Not because the world allowed it, but because he said so. 2 weeks later, Mira and Sons announced they were renaming a new location, Mira and Sons, the Thomas Lounge. Not because the incident had gone viral. It hadn't. In fact, no one had even recorded it. But because of a handwritten letter from the company's CEO, acknowledging that sometimes the things no one sees are the things most worth remembering. At the grand opening, there was no ribbon-cutting ceremony, but on the wall there hung a hand-drawn picture, a boy holding a cinnamon-dusted cappuccino, walking beside a woman in a brown coat with curly hair. Beneath it was the line Jalen had once written, "Everyone deserves to belong." No one stood and stared at that line for long, but in the weeks that followed, people began to notice something. Children sitting alone in corners of the cafe, being served a warm drink with a genuine smile from staff. No one asked if they were accompanied. No one judged their shoes or their wallets. It was just a regular coffee shop. But this time, it meant what it said. Anyone who walked in would be welcome. And if you're still thinking about the image of a boy who stood up for himself, not with anger, but with quiet courage, you're not alone. Maybe you were once Jalen. Maybe you were pushed aside because you didn't look the part. Or maybe you stayed silent when someone right in front of you was treated unfairly. But today you witnessed something. You can belong. You can speak up. You can make a difference. Even if you're young, unnoticed, or never chosen first. If this story warmed your heart, moved you, or even made you feel outraged, that's a sign your heart still cares, and this world still has hope. Share this video if you believe human dignity deserves equal treatment, regardless of age, skin color, or wallet size. Drop a comment below. Have you ever been in a situation like Jalen's? Or witnessed someone being judged unfairly based on appearance? And if you want more true stories, with twists, justice, and raw emotion, hit that subscribe button. These aren't just videos. They're reminders that we can do good simply by listening and looking closer.